Welcome to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff of Politics and Pros, critically acclaimed sports journalist and author of A People's History of Sports in the United States. Dave Zirin chronicles the Kaepernick Effect for the first time through interviews with a broad cross-section of professional athletes across many different sports, college stars, and high-powered athletic directors, and high school athletes and coaches. In each case, he uncovers the fascinating explanations and motivations behind the mass political movement in sports through deeply personal and inspiring accounts of risk-taking, activism, and courage both on and off the field. A book about the politics of sport and the impact of sports on politics, The Kaepernick Effect is for anyone seeking to understand an essential dimension of the new movement for racial justice in America. Dave Zirin is one of UT&E Reader's 50 visionaries who are changing our world, the sports editor of The Nation, a columnist for The Progressive, and host of the Edge of Sports podcast. His many books include A People's History of Sports United States, Game Over, Bad Sports, and The Kaepernick Effect. Zirin has also been a regular guest on MSNBC, CNN, and ESPN. He will be in conversation today with Michael Lee, a sports enterprise reporter at the Washington Post, focusing on the intersection of gender, diversity, and how sports shape our society. Lee previously worked at the Post from 2004 to 2015, serving as the national NBA writer and beat writer for the Washington Wizards. He is a longtime NBA scribe who covered the league for 19 seasons at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Post, Yahoo Sports, and The Athletic. He has covered 3 Olympics, 2004 Athens, 2008 Beijing, and 2016 Rio de Janeiro, the World Series, and the NCAA men's basketball tournament. Without any further ado, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Dave, it's an honor to be here with you right now, man. You did this excellent book, The Kaepernick Effect, and I guess we just jump right in, man. The one thing that really struck me about this book is I know you very well. I know you're very opinionated. I know you have very strong opinions, and you're not afraid to share them or express them, and you're not afraid of the backlash that comes with it. But with this book, you took a different approach. You decided to let the subjects just go and share their stories and got out of the way. What led you to this approach, and what was it like to talk to these people, and how did you find these subjects?
Well, first of all, great to be here. Politics and Pros, huge part of my life as long as I've been in DC. Great to talk to you, Michael. I really want to hear from you as well about the Kaepernick effect on your own life and experiences, because I find that fascinating as well, because you do such great work with the Washington Post, and that work's really been transformed by the changes in our society and our changes in the intersection of sports and politics. And I'd love for you to speak on that. I mean, first and foremost, let me just say that I started doing this book at the beginning of the pandemic because, for a very simple reason, like, I was concerned that the voices of these young people who'd taken a knee were sort of getting memory holed by history. And every time I was reading about Colin Kaepernick, it was always about, will he ever get signed again? And will Colin Kaepernick, do this, or will he speak out on this issue, or won't he speak out? What's happening with Kaepernick in the NFL? And for me, what I found much more interesting than that were these one-off stories that I would see in places like the Washington Post and other publications, the local press as well, of these athletes, young athletes, particularly high school, who were taking a knee. And I was just thinking to myself, like, so many athletes have done this. And as I started calculating it, I was like, my goodness, you've had maybe thousands of young athletes in this country have taken a knee during the national anthem to protest police brutality and racial inequity. I was like, who are these folks? And can we try to understand this as a national movement, as a national push, and not just look at it as these one-offs, and let's preserve their history. So I just started calling them. And this was where the one plus of this terrible pandemic in my own life, the one plus is that all these young people, pre-vaccine, they were at home, with nothing to do. And people know this who have teenagers. I have 2 of them. If you're calling them, you better be like trapped under your car, or else they're not answering the phone. They talk by text.
Absolutely.
Calls are for emergencies. I once called my daughter just to be like, hey, when are you getting home? And she was like, oh my God, I was so worried when you called. Why did you do that? And I was like, all right, my bad. I'll text next time. So it's just, they're very intense about that. But they were just home and bored. And so, willing to talk to this middle-aged white sports writer about why they took a knee and what happened. And so we just were talking and talking and talking. And as I was talking to them, I really became struck by the level of political sophistication in terms of how they saw themselves relative to the sports world and relative to the real world. I mean, and in speaking to them, they all got crash courses. Very few of them knew who people like Tommy Smith and John Carlos were. Very few knew more than just the basics of people like Muhammad Ali, but they started learning after they got caught in this maelstrom of bringing politics into the world of sports. So that was just very stunning to me and interesting. And that led me to really think about, centering their voices instead of my own. I also wanted to center their voices because honestly, Colin Kaepernick has chosen largely silence over the last 5 years. So I was like, what if I can center the voices of these true heroes and sheroes who really dared to take that knee and come hell what may? So that was the beginning. But then when we hit the summer and Derek Chauvin murders George Floyd, and we have the largest protests in the history of the United States. And I don't think we say that enough. Those were the largest in history. I went back and called all the people that I interviewed, and just to be like, what do you think of these protests? And the first thing that was very striking was they were all in the streets. At this point, I had to do a lot of texting. They were all out there. They were organizing. And so that made me think like, okay, this is about more than just rescuing their voices from being forgotten. This is about there being a direct line between the biggest protests in US history and protests on the athletic field. Like many roads may have led us to the summer of 2020, but one of those roads runs through the playing fields of this country. And that to me was an important thing to capture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, the knee has sort of become, such a major body part as it relates to protests, but also just in symbolism for this country. Obviously the fist was such a big deal beginning in '68 with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, a person you know very well. But when you think about the knee and what Kaepernick did, in just kneeling, humbly, to just ask for just awareness and for people to just give Black people and brown people, their rights in this country. And then you go to Chauvin, who kneeled on George Floyd's neck as a weapon to murder him. And just the way those two images, are sort of emblazoned in our brains right now. What are your thoughts just on the power of that symbol of the knee now and just what that's come to represent over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because it's like, the book, it's the Kaepernick Effect, taking a knee, changing the world. The act of taking that knee has become so iconic at this point that if I was at a sporting event and the anthem played and I took a knee, everybody would immediately know what I was doing. Every single person in that stadium would know why, would know I wasn't doing it out of a show of support, or I wasn't doing a Tim Tebow thing, in some, whatever.
Yeah.
People would know. People would be like, oh, whether they loved it or hated it, they would know why I was doing it. That's how incredibly iconic it become. And like, since this book's come out, like doing interviews with reporters from Nigeria, from Europe. I mean, it's really remarkable. Like for them, like at their protests, people are taking knees when there are instances of police violence. It is, that's one of the double-edged swords about the United States being so hegemonic throughout the world culturally, is that we also export our protests and forms of protest. The thing about Kaepernick, though, which is so interesting to me, and you alluded to this in your question, is that we got to remember he started by just sitting during the anthem in August of 2016. And he went to taking a knee after that initial firestorm developed after a discussion with a former Green Beret and NFL player, Nate Boyer. And they came up with this idea of taking a knee because it was thought that it would show all the people who were hating on Kaepernick that he respects and understands why they view this anthem space as solemn, but at the same time, he is going to register his dissent. So it
Yeah.
was supposed to be a kind of like, let's disagree without being disagreeable kind of thing. And, he quickly learned that if people don't want to hear your message, they're not going to care how you dress it up, because you are the messenger, and therefore you're the reason they're not enjoying football. You're making them confront racism that when they don't want to do it. You're basically imposing a conversation upon them that they either don't want to have or are actively hostile towards. And then, of course, Donald Trump pours gasoline on that fire and uses Colin Kaepernick as this all-purpose punching bag for the next several months, which only raises the stakes, though, of taking that knee. And people knowing that when they take that knee, they're going to be saying something. But I would argue, and I argue in this book, that this is Colin Kaepernick's great historic contribution to a legacy that we have in this country of resistance. Is this posture is something that anybody can do. And it's like a language by which you can do this and people will know what you're about and what you're doing. That's incredibly precious for people to have that, because some of the people I interviewed are from places like Beaumont, Texas. Like, you can't walk out your door of Beaumont, Texas and go to the local Black Lives Matter demonstration. That's not your reality. But you can play football, and that's where football might as well be a religion, and take that knee on a Friday night and really impose this conversation that you're desperate to have, but that people might not want to hear.
Yeah, one of the things that always struck me about the reaction to Colin Kaepernick taking the knee and just his whole protest is that obviously whenever you stand up or take a knee for causes that for Black people, you're going to get a negative backlash. It doesn't matter if he took a knee for breast cancer awareness, he would have been hailed. He would have been, they would have been praising him for taking a stand for an issue that everyone supports. I don't understand why people don't support equality. And the thing that struck me too is that people said it was anti-American, which is it's the funniest thing I ever heard, because America was built off of protest. We wouldn't be the United States of America without a protest, to get this whole thing kicked off. And so it's always unique. But for me, the stories that you tell, going from high school to college to pros and speaking to all these individuals, there were some common themes. A lot of them were not received well. A lot of them didn't have support from their either their teammates or their coaches, especially their communities. There was a backlash for it. And I want to know just how you were able to single out these individuals and find their stories, find some certain common themes, but also sift through to see what makes them different. And I just wanted to see how you were able to avoid redundancy in telling these stories, and what common themes stood out for you.
Which was an editorial challenge, because some of the stories are very have similarities, but the thing that unites them is a couple of things that to me will stay with me for all times. One of the things that unites them is the specter of violence as a response to their actions. And in almost every case, it's like, here they are doing this peaceful protest, and the response is not, I disagree with you, or wow, that really made me think, or gee, maybe we should have a conversation. The response is, I am going to hurt you because you are saying things that I don't want to hear. And there's an element of, I don't know how else to put it, but white rage that can bubble up when being confronted with some of the historic crimes of this country, instead of wrestling and reckoning with whether it's the expropriation of land of Native Americans or the transatlantic slave trade or how the railroads were built, whatever it is. It's like there is a part of this population which will respond in fury. I mean, think about it. Like, we're having this discussion in the context of some states, they're making it illegal to talk about slavery, for goodness sakes, in the classroom. I mean, this is, I mean, what is that about, except the desire to not have to reckon with the actuality of history? And that's what these young people experienced when they took this knee. Another common thread, which was really striking, is that I would ask them, like, what were the motivations for doing it? And they would inevitably name like some local struggles that upset them, and they would sometimes talk about, like, I saw Colin Kaepernick do it, and I was like, I want to get some of the weight off his shoulders and bring the struggle to my community. But the name that everybody said was Trayvon Martin. And that was so striking to me, because of course I think of Trayvon Martin 14-year-old Sanford, Florida, stalked and killed by George Zimmerman, who didn't have to spend a day in jail for his crimes. I think of Trayvon Martin as one, frankly, of many tragedies that we've had to experience collectively over the last decade. For these young folks, though, they're 10 years old when Trayvon Martin is killed. So they're old enough to know it's happening, but also young enough to wonder why it has to be, and ask that question earnestly. And it scarred them the way the civil rights generation, you hear folks, the vets, talk about Emmett Till and the way Emmett Till is lynched, and then nothing is ever the same after that, once they see the images of his lynching. And this to me was extremely similar with Trayvon Martin, how it stuck with people in a way that was more like a scar than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it always, you spoke to, high school kids and college kids, and people in every generation, you're always going to look down at the one below you and be like, oh, they're not strong, or they're tough. They're not tough, or they're snowflakes or whatever. In this generation, I think that's below us, they take a lot of that, for being soft. And really, they're just basically saying, we're not going to accept, what you all willing to accept for generations. But when you think about all they've been through, from basically living with war going on their entire lives, 9/11, school shootings, like repeatedly, obviously with these incidents with Trayvon Martin or Philando Castile, just whoever you want to go name down the list. And then you have, now we're in a pandemic. When you think about what all this generation has had to endure, what do you think about just the misconception that they're not strong? I mean, just in how that somehow it permeates through society, that we just accept that, oh, they just can't take it. They're not tough enough.
Yeah, I take it from the complete opposite point, which is that this generation is less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. And thank goodness for that. I told you my daughter's 17. I talked to her friends and it's like they're just not willing to settle for what other generations are willing to settle for. And one of her friends said something to me that was really smart. Like she's a type, and she said to me, we're always put down for being apathetic, but then we do something and we're put down for that. It's almost like the one thing worse than being apathetic is actually doing something. So it's like we put them between this rock and a hard place, and they have to wrestle with, how they're going to function in a society that I would argue really does look down on this generation. I saw this terrific comic that was so perfect, where it was like somebody who's around our age talking to a teenager, and they said, "Why are you so depressed all the time?" And the teenager says, "Gee, I don't know. The environment, police brutality, school shootings, war." And the older person says, "I knew it was those cell phones." So it's like we've reduced them to just being like, oh, they're in this constant state of on their phones, and therefore they can't communicate and talk to other people. And it's like, they organized the biggest set of protests in the history of the United States in 2020. Don't act like that phone is some magnet away from civic engagement. For some of these folks, it's actually their window towards it.
Yeah. One thing that's, you touched on a lot of subjects. You talked to a lot of different people, and some of them actually, hit me personally for just different reasons. I don't know why. And one of them was Alexis Bazin, the UPenn cheerleader, who grew up in Thomasville, Georgia. And so it really connected with me because, she had a friend from her church, or I guess a relative, who was murdered by police. And in Tallahassee, obviously, I went to college in Tallahassee, Florida A&M, and I worked in Georgia for 6 years, and I covered high schools for a lot of those years. So I spent time in Thomasville, spent time in rural areas, and it really hit me that her friend was murdered, because when I was in college, our school newspaper was printed in Cairo, Georgia. So we had to drive across state lines to get our paper printed, and then deliver it to campus every week. And so I took that drive a lot, and I probably had one of my most fearsome experiences with police in Georgia, in South Georgia, crossing over the state line. I got pulled over, and just because I didn't signal from switching lanes. Now no car was around me for a mile, but I got pulled over by a cop, and of course 4 cop cars came with him. and they all had the lights flashing. They were all just there for little old me, who was just driving home from college. And so, those type of incidents and those type of situations are probably why, what Kaepernick did hit so hard with me, and why the backlash toward him made it so personal for me, because I couldn't believe that people were upset that someone spoke out for something that has been plaguing, people that look like me for a long time, for generations. I mean, I had to talk with my dad, didn't know what he was talking about when he sat me down to tell me, what I needed to do. He laid it out for me. Don't talk back. Say yes, sir. Put your hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. Look him in the eye, make sure that, that is not threatened by you. I didn't understand what he was talking about. But then, of course, I've been pulled over at least 3 times in my life. And I don't necessarily, when I see a police car coming by, I don't necessarily feel like I'm going to be protected. I feel like I am all of a sudden in danger sometimes. And so that part, I think with her, it struck me. And there are a lot of other ones that really connected. I want to know for you, were there any stories that you were writing or any, that really hit you in a place where you're like, oh man, I can relate to this person, or, oh man, I did not know it was that bad?
I gotta say, in some respects, it's difficult to choose, because I look at all the people who I spoke with as family almost, because since I spoke to so many people who are so young, after I wrote up their stories, I sent it to them, which is not my typical practice at all. But I just was like, because I was like, look, this book's going to get some exposure. So 2 things. 1, are you sure you want to be in this? So I'm giving you a chance now, after you read what you said to me, to back out, because a lot of people opened up. So I was like, maybe you don't want that, out there for the world. And the second thing I said, is there anything that you want to change? And I got to say, everybody I spoke to, only one person said, yeah, I don't think I'm comfortable being public. Everybody else of the people that I winnowed it down to said, this is my life's work. This is something I want to be a part of. And, so it's just like my affection for them is very strong. But I have to say, the story of Rodney Axon sticks with me very strongly. He is, from all of my research, the first person in the country to take a knee after Kaepernick did. He's a football player from Brunswick, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And his story resonated with me so strongly because he grew up in Cleveland in a very rough neighborhood. His mom moves them to Brunswick so he can be, quote unquote, safe and get a good education in Brunswick at a predominantly white school. Well, it doesn't take long for him to feel very unsafe in these new surroundings, whether it's interactions with police or whether it's the largely white football team of which he was a member, throwing around racial slurs like it was nothing. And he would try to handle it by saying to them, hey, I don't want that in my space. Don't say that in front of me. And their response would be to say, well, we're not talking about you. We're talking about these other people. You're our teammate. You're our guy. It's these other people. Don't you get that? It's not racist because, we're teammates. Therefore, it's not racist, and it just, this was like he described it to me as like just like an itch in his head where it was just making him more and more upset and he just couldn't scratch it. And he was, of course, like most people in his generation who are conscious, he was also very upset about, the images in the news, what he was learning off of social media, the violence against Black people at the hands of police, and feeling like, what the hell am I supposed to do about this in Brunswick? And this had been building for a long time. And then he sees Kaepernick take that knee and it's like, ding, that I can do. So in the next game, he takes a knee and makes it clear that he's doing it because of racism on the football team and racism in society. And he expected there to not get necessarily applause for it or anything. He knew what he was doing. He went in eyes wide open. But what he didn't expect was for it to become a story that circulated well beyond Brunswick. And then the death threats start coming in. And the fear starts coming in. And all he wanted to do was to try to create a discussion where he was. Like that the ambitions are so modest. from a lot of the people I talked with. Like, let's have a discussion. Let's talk about this. What can you do as a white person to help me, fight racism? Like let's actually try to chop it up and figure that out, because you can't be a bystander when there's this level of crisis. And yet, not only did he get pushback from team and coaches, he's now having to walk his elementary school age sister to school because of violent threats. And he's worried about her. So he has to make sure she's protected in this leafy suburb of Cleveland, where it was supposed to be safe and good. So, but the thing about Rodney's story that sticks with me is that, appropriately and very on purpose, he was the first person I called when the demonstrations broke after George Floyd was murdered. And he was like, not only did he feel profoundly vindicated by just seeing all those folks in the streets, he was organizing. He was doing his thing. He was, like so many of the people I spoke to, like that knee was only a first step towards, frankly, being a different kind of person relative to the rest of society.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciated about this book too is that you spoke to women and Black women in particular. I think that, obviously the book is the Kaepernick Effect. And I don't know if people realize this, and I've only recently become aware of it, but, the story of Rose Robinson, who was the first person to protest the anthem, at least that we know of, athlete to protest the anthem back in 1959 in the Pan Am Games. And so that's a story that isn't told very much, but it sort of goes back to how, in a lot of ways, the role of Black women and just what they've done in terms of helping save our democracy, in 2020, but also in terms of just how they've always been at the backbone of the civil rights movement and everything else. Why did you feel it was important to tell these stories too? I mean, obviously I've expressed it, but why did you feel it was important to just make sure that it's not just going to be the famous people that you've heard of? It's not just going to be, these male figures that get a lot of the attention.
Yeah, that was the only thing in the entire book that was hyper intentional. I was like, there's gonna be gender balance in this book, and we're going to hear the voices of Black women in this book, because they're the backbone, as you said, and the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that of course has reflected itself in the world of sports. And secondly, because their stories are remarkable, because in addition to dealing with racism as a backlash, they had to deal with sexism too, in terms of what they get over social media, in terms of what people would say about them in school for doing it, in terms of the response of their coaches. And, they had to deal with that extra layer of oppression, and they dealt with it with such strength and resolve that to me, those stories were a necessity, particularly when it got to talking to the cheerleaders, because that was stunning to me. The examples of the cheerleaders taking a knee, and oftentimes they did so for two reasons that to me are really interesting. The first is they did it because they were waiting for the football team to do it, and they were planning to kneel sort of in solidarity with the football team. But for whatever reason, the football team not willing to step up, and so they're like, all right, they're not going to do it, we're going to do it, so that sense of actually feeling a new sense of power relative to the football team was amazing. And second, a cheerleader is going to see themselves as kind of the face of the school, and the outward face of the school are the cheerleaders. And for them to take a knee, it was their way of telling the community, not everything is okay here in Smallville. We've got problems here, and people don't want to address those problems. And so we're going to take a knee to actually compel you to ask us, what about our experiences in this environment?
What do you feel has been the effect on society overall, in terms of what changes have you seen come from this, and how sustainable is it? Because I think a lot of times, and even for me, I question, like just last in 2020, I was like, is this going to last? Is this energy going to, really last? Because eventually you get tired, especially if you don't see change, and it looks like, there may not be any legislature that's going to, affect policing. There may not be anything that's going to really have the lasting effects that people would hope. And I just kind of want to know what you see what difference have you seen made through all this?
Well, one difference is what you do for a living every day. And I would love for you to speak about that, about the changes in what you do as a journalist over the last 4 years. But before I cue you up on that, I will take an effort to answer that question. I see huge changes. You know, John Carlos, we talked about before, 1968 Olympian, raised his fist. He once said to me, "Hey, Dave, have you ever thought about the fact that we raised our fists in 68 and athletes finally started to get paid in the 70s?" And I was like, well, yeah, I always just sort of saw them as different things, like athletes in the 70s. That was about Kurt Flood, free agency. And John Carlos gave me one of those looks that was like, shit. He's like, you realize the black athletes are what keep the lights on all these sports. And when we reflected how angry so many black athletes were, the revolt of the black athlete is what it was called. When we reflected that, the fear factor of the powers that be said, okay, we need to grant reforms or they might give us revolution. And so you start to see these changes in the sports world in terms of freeing up the purse strings as you get into the 70s. It's an interesting connection. And then if you tease it out to Kaepernick, I look at things like college sports giving on name, image, and likeness because of so many athletes being restive. Does that definitely doesn't happen with the Black Lives Matter movement, but I don't know if it happens without Kaepernick either, you know, bringing it to the world of sports. And secondly, the Washington football team changing its name after the owner, Dan Snyder, says, never, you know, we're never going to do it. And you could put all that in caps, all caps, as he infamously said. Well, that changed mighty quick during the quote unquote reckoning of 2020. And some of that, I mean, and I interviewed a ton of indigenous rights activists, and they all said, you know, Black Lives Matter movement and Kaepernick bringing it into sports, because we've been doing this work for decades, and now we're seeing changes in days that have taken us decades to move. And that's what happens when you have social upheaval. You know, previous victories that seem to take generations all of a sudden are bam, right there in your face. And so those differences, just basically in the world of sports, I think strongly are influenced by Colin Kaepernick, because what he showed was that, you know, the same issue is like, you know, what John Carlos was talking about then. It's like, you can't just cheer for black bodies and not care what's happening in black lives. You know, that was the theme of the revolt of the black athlete. And it's absolutely the theme today. I mean, there was a huge banner to that effect before Kaepernick that was spread out at the St. Louis Rams game. They were then called the St. Louis Rams. At the St. Louis Rams games after Michael Brown was killed by the officer Darren Wilson, and 4 members of the St. Louis Rams, including, I always want to say, the son of a member of De La Soul.
Maceo.
Because I always find that amazing. They came out with their hands up before the game and wrote things like, "My child's life matters" on their uniforms. But in the stands, there were also movement people who threw down this massive banner that said you can't cheer for black lives on the field and not care what happens to them off the field. Or it was like Black Lives Matter whether or not they're playing sports. But it was like a massive banner, and they quickly got kicked out of the stadium, even though they had tickets. So, you know, so much for free speech in a stadium that was built with public dollars, but maybe that's a different conversation. But
you've had.
Yeah, but I would love it, Michael, if you could say something, because we're talking about changes that were wrought by what Kaepernick did. If you could just say something about you, because I used to read you well before we knew each other, doing the Washington Wizards reports in the Washington Post, and you know, always one of my go-to basketball writers for years and years. But that's not what you're doing right now.
No. Right now, I'm explicitly looking at the role of race in sport, and just seeing how you know, things are sort of being viewed now, and what changes are occurring. You know, obviously, you know, like I said, Kaepernick's kneeling had a huge effect on me right away. I remember when he first did it, and I was just like, oh man, I hope he can handle this, and I hope he can express himself in a way that he won't look foolish, you know, because you know, I just didn't know what to expect. And so the fact that he knew what he was talking about and could express himself in a way that was clear and coherent, I got behind him, and I was like, this is it. This has got to be it. People have to wake up and recognize that this is serious and that this is something that we need to, to listen to and adhere to. Of course, that didn't happen to the level that I thought it should have. But since when he did that, I was, working at Yahoo Sports, and so I was, moved to write a column, about just the NBA. I tied into the NBA and just, allowing, the league just allowing these players to just express themselves and not to punish them, the way they did Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, for taking this stand against the anthem. And so the last couple of years, you can't write about sports without writing about some element of politics. Players aren't going to shut up and dribble anymore. They have a lot to say. They have a lot of opinions about everything. And then you saw it last year in the bubble in Orlando, where players really spoke out on social justice issues. And I was proud of them. I was proud of the Milwaukee Bucks for, just saying, hey, no, we're not playing tonight, and I thought that was probably one of the more powerful images of their entire season. And I remember writing a column after they lost to the, Miami Heat in embarrassing fashion. I said they had nothing to be ashamed of this year because the stand that they took is the one that will be remembered long after this season. And it still is. And then you look back and you see a year later, they won the championship. And I honestly believe that was rooted in them taking a stand, and it brought them together as a team because they dealt with that adversity. They were able to withstand, a season, this year and come away as champions. And I admired them for that. So the stories that I tell now are so much different than the ones that I did in the past. I mean, just in the past year, I got a chance to write about how, the election was changed because, like LeBron with his More Than a Vote, campaign, and other athletes who open up their, training facilities, teams that open up their facilities as voting, venues, and it's just allowing people to have more access, and especially in the Black community where they try to, whittle down, their voting sites and polling sites. I had a chance to interview Colin Hill, a running back from Mississippi State who's now at the Green Bay Packers, who basically said, as long as we have this Confederate, battle emblem on this flag, I'm not going to play for Mississippi State anymore. And, that wasn't the thing that, led to the final, it was like he ran it in from the 1 yard line because there had been a push for it to happen. And so to be able to tell these stories and also to see how it affects, these players, because I remember talking to an executive, NFL, executive about how is this going to affect his career. Colin Hill, he said, he'll probably still go in the 3rd to 5th round. Colin Hill went in the 7th round. Now, I don't know why, maybe because he was undersized, maybe because, you can come up with whatever you want, but you also can pinpoint, the fact that he took a stance that wasn't popular and put his family in danger. So it's really opened my eyes in how I, cover sports now and how I see sports now. I mean, there always was a racial element. There always were things that you couldn't deny, but now it's in your face. And now players are willing to go out there and make their presence felt in a way that they didn't in the past. Kaepernick kind of had to take that hit to his career and to his livelihood, to his, losing his dream of being an NFL great, to, become great in another area that was not something that anybody could have predicted for him when he came out of high school or college. But now he's got Netflix series and everything else. So it's just been a great period thing to write. It's forced me to, think in a different way and pursue stories in a different way. So it's been great for me in a lot of ways. I get to go back to the Post and be at a great company and really tell some cool stories.
But like, did you ever think either at Florida A&M or at the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, did you ever think you'd be writing? I mean, you've always been a political person, but did you ever think you'd be able to apply your politics to the world of sports as your job?
No, because it never really came up, right? Yeah. I mean, in the 90s, when I first started in the industry, it was just like, what happens on the court? What happens on the field? Just tell the story and get out of the way. But I think that now you're seeing the athletes are demanding that their humanity is there, that people see them for who they are, and that they're not just there to entertain you, but they're also there to make you think if you're willing, if you're open to it. And I think that that's been good, you know. And I also appreciate the guys who understand that they can't speak right now, that they don't feel comfortable coming out there and they stay silent, you know, because I think there's some ways you can hurt the movement by just, you know, by not knowing what you're talking about and expressing things that could be hurtful or damaging in the long run. So I thought that a lot of the guys, especially in the NBA last year, who were willing to, you know, make their comments and make their statements, they were well read, they were well versed, and they expressed themselves in a way that you couldn't deny, you know, their intelligence and just their humanity. Like, yeah, I play ball, I put a ball through a hole, and I make a lot of money doing it, but I'm also a citizen. I'm also a person who has a family. I'm also a brother. I'm a son. I'm a husband. I'm a boyfriend. I'm whatever. And you got to see all of me to really appreciate what I do on the court. And for some people, that might be too much. They just want to just be entertained and move on. But for other people, it allows you to sort of have that deeper connection with an athlete to where it's like, okay, I root for you because you play for my team, but I also root for you because I want to see you succeed because I know you're standing for what's right.
I got to say that the story of the WNBA, the Atlanta Dream, and Senator Kelly Loeffler, I mean, there should be a movie.
Yeah.
That's cinematic. I mean, you have this woman who owns 49% of the Atlanta Dream, incredibly wealthy senator, all the power in the world, all the, you know, everything at her fingertips, friend of Trump, everything. And then she decides that she's going to run for re-election, but on the back of the Black Lives Matter movement and on the back of the idea of her own players being political. That she's like, I'm going to be the person who steps on their necks as part of winning my re-election for senator. And one of her players, someone by the name of Renee Montgomery, even asked, can we meet? Can we talk? Can we actually try to suss this out? Kelly Loeffler refused to meet with her. Well, people know what happened, but Kelly Loeffler no longer in the Senate, the WNBA playing a key role in electing Raphael Warnock. But the part of the story that to me makes it cinematic is that Renee Montgomery is now part owner of the Atlanta Dream, and Kelly Loeffler is somewhere on Siberia.
Yes.
So that's quite a turn of events, Michael.
Yeah, I remember it's like when you think about Major League and the movie where, you know, they wanted to, you know, stick it to the owner, you know, win just to stick it to the owner. And it's like, they're like, okay, if you want to go to war with us, you just realize that we are competitors. Like, this is what we do. Like, we are not trying to lose. Like, we've been winning our whole lives. And if you want to go toe to toe with us, just know we're going to bring all we got. And I think that's what Kelly Loeffler wasn't prepared for. She didn't know that these players for the Dream were, you know, these are athletes. Like, if you decide to get into the ring with them, just know they're going to do whatever it takes to beat you. And I think you saw their power in that move for sure.
Yeah, and they looked at the polls, and I believe Raphael Warnock was running at about 9% when they said, we're going to get behind this person. They could have face planted so hard doing this and then been left with this WNBA owner standing ascendant over their lives, being like, yeah, the time for, you know, shut up and dribble has begun, and I'm going to be the face of that. Like, that was what was on the table for them. Like, really the renunciation of everything that the WNBA had tried to build in terms of being a league that says we care about the court, we also care about the individual and what players are thinking and doing. Kelly Loeffler like stood for the negation of all of that, and they won.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing I think that stands out about it too, and we'll move to question and answer after this, but I think the one thing that whole fight that they had, and also just the women WNBA players in the bubble, is that I think it added to the visibility of that sport, and it led to the popularity. Because I think now you see, you know, more NBA players are coming out in support of the WNBA players. They're wearing the orange, you know, hoodie, you know, and I think a lot of people are starting to get behind them now. And like, you're starting to really see that, one, these women are really, they're ballers. Like, they can hoop, you know, and you know, all the guys who, you know, say the lame jokes on Twitter or whatever, they get shamed, you know, now because you're starting to appreciate the women's game a lot more. And so I think a lot of that is because they stood up and they said, you're going to see us, you know, we're going to stand up for Breonna Taylor because she's us. And we're going to make sure that you see her and that you see her through us. And I think that's been a great, thing for the WNBA, that their players stepped up, and now people have no choice but to recognize that these are women and they are incredible athletes, and we got to get behind them and support them.
And oh, just real quick, another Brianna Stewart, who is one of the great players in the WNBA and is white. I say she's white not just because it's factual, because it plays into this story. I was interviewing her, and she had just come out with an incredible statement about sexual abuse that she'd experienced as part of being an athlete. And I asked her about where the confidence to do something like that comes from, to really bear yourself like that. And she's talked about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. So that's the Kaepernick effect too. And this is what Brianna Stewart said to me, is she said, courage is contagious. And I think that's one of the reasons also why there was such a ferocious backlash against Colin Kaepernick, because there's this realization that, okay, this is about so much more even than the issue he's taking a knee around. This is about people standing up and having a sense of themselves as citizens that can make demands for a better world.
There's this commercial now that the NFL puts out, like, who's got my back? Who's got my back? Who's got my back? And it's like, it's a great commercial if you didn't already prove that you don't have Kaepernick's back, and you got two guys out of the league right now who clearly who no longer in the game, not necessarily because of their skills.
First of all, I would say let's make no mistake about it. The reason why Eric Reed and Kenny Stills are not in the league, they're being colluded against. And I think anybody who says otherwise, it's one of those expressions of, please don't spit in my face and tell me it's raining type moments where it's like, oh no, Kenny Stills, Eric Reed, it's a competition and the best players are who's on the field. It's like, that's not true, because there are different interests than just winning. And if there weren't, then Colin Kaepernick would have a job instead of some of the quarterbacks who are out there. So the NFL's exposed itself. And I really do believe that as time goes on, and this is on Roger Goodell, Colin Kaepernick's exclusion from the league is going to be looked at the way the color line is looked at in Major League Baseball, as this kind of mark that will never be erased from the sport. Like, wow, this guy tried to speak out for change in a peaceful manner, and that was just too much for you. How dare you ever speak to us about social justice ever again? How dare you put end racism in the end zone? Who do you think you are with this carrot and stick nonsense? You are keeping Colin Kaepernick out of the league, and that should never be forgotten. And so that to me is a part of it. No one's taking a knee right now, but I think but that's just at the NFL. And part of my point with the book is that we got to look beyond the pros. I got an email just the other day of a little league team taking a knee during the anthem, right next to a team that was all standing at attention with their hands over hearts, with their hats off. And I was like, wow, first of all, why are we playing the national anthem before a little league game is a question worth asking, and that seems a little intense to me. And, but also that they all were like, yeah, we're going to take a knee right now. Was very cool. And their coach wasn't taking a knee. I mean, it was the young people doing it. And however it was organized is amazing. I met this young person. People don't believe this story. You got to please just believe me this. He came up to me, and his parent is a friend of mine. And he said, hey, I just wanted to tell you, I know you write about people taking knees in protest of racism. We were doing the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and I took a knee. And I said, wow, are you a fan of Colin Kaepernick? This kid was in 4th grade. He said to me, who's Colin Kaepernick?
Wow.
All he knew was this idea of taking a knee was a way to say racism, I don't want it. I don't want it in this classroom. And I want to make that very clear to all my classmates.
Wow, that's deep. That's deep.
Yeah.
That's really, that's one thing I wonder, is I think some people may forget that Colin was a very good football player, that he led his team to the Super Bowl. And I think a lot of ways the NFL has done a lot to erase, his contributions. You saw it even, I think, during the Super Bowl when they were in there and they were making these references that sort of just eliminate the fact that they were just in the Super Bowl, less than 10 years ago. And it was sort of upsetting because you can't wipe out, what the guy did, but you wonder if people will remember him, for why he was given a platform to begin with. Did any of you spoke with talk about pushback from parents, school administrators, or coaches for their advocacy? And if so, can you speak to specific examples about the pushback they receive?
Oh, yes. The book is in 3 sections: high school, college, and pros. And I could say at the high school level, that's when you have the presence of parents very strongly. And then it gets even bigger with administrations and school systems. One story, you asked for a specific example, Garfield High School in Seattle, where the players decided to take a knee after it was going to be just a couple of players on the football team. And then the coach, Joey Thomas, who I also interviewed, he went in and he said, we're either going to do this as a team or we're not going to do it. So let's actually have a debate and discussion about the pros and cons of this and about racism and all the rest of it. And they came to a collective decision. Yeah, we should all take a knee. And, this is Seattle. And so they thought they would get, some nice dap for it because it's liberal, big city and all the rest of it. But the reality was quite different. Coach Thomas had his tires slashed, and death threats were called into the school. And it ended with Coach Thomas having to quit because he's now in Florida because he was getting so much institutionalized harassment from the school system, like to force him out. And it just became too much, like, oh, we're going to reassign you here. Oh, we're not going to reassign you. Oh, we think you recruited a player illegally and we're going to put out a press release to that effect. Oh, whoops. That was a mistake. You didn't really do anything wrong. And it got to the level of harassment got to be too much. And so you see, particularly at the high school level, why I think these young people are so brave, because the forces allied against them are so intense. And at every level that the questioner described, from the level of parents, coaches, teammates, administrators. Now, certainly sometimes it was better than others. Sometimes good things came out of it and all the rest of it. But wow, it was quite a mountain for them to climb.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was, one of the more powerful sections of the book too. And like I said, I like the fact that you talked to high schools, and one of them when you talked to was Minneapolis North.
Yes.
Which
Like,
I obviously their coach Charles Adams was a cop, on the police force. And did you try to speak to him? Because I mean, he's a unique position as like leading this powerhouse football program, but also being Black and being blue at the same time. And just, did you get a chance to speak to him at all?
I made the effort.
Okay.
Polite declining on that front. But I loved telling that story from Minneapolis North because, they received a lot of backlash too, but they ended up winning the championship.
Yeah.
So it actually had bonded them and brought them together. And of course, I went back and talked to them, both a teacher, Marjan Sirdar, who was incredibly generous at this time, and with Michael, who's the football player with whom I spoke. And the insights they had about what happened with George Floyd. I mean, because it's never, anytime you have a situation that blows up like Minneapolis, it's about George Floyd, but it's also not about George Floyd. It's about people seeing their own experiences in what happened to him, and their ability to speak to that is really important because, there's that old expression about, Minnesota nice, and that everybody's, smiles and everything's hunky dory all the time. And it's like that's sometimes used as a way to paper over the very real problems that certainly Black and brown folks have in trying to navigate this, overwhelmingly white state.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, my grandmother's from St. Paul, so I'm familiar with Minneapolis.
That's the other thing. I went to college in St. Paul. I went to college in St. Paul to McAllister College. So just like the tices I feel to the Twin Cities are strong too.
Yeah, I have family there, so I always like to see them when I go up to when I went to Timberwolves games. I would go check them out and say what's up.
Right.
Yeah, so it's I mean, just the fact that you're able to get the city where a lot of things popped off in 2020. I got a question here from Michael Slinger. I'm sorry. How do you think all of this will affect the 2022 election?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's going to be all about, to me, like, let's basically, what we're really talking about is the Democratic Party and their ability to hang on to the slim margins that they have or not, even though historically it looks like they won't, because it's a midterm election during the first term of a presidency, and those never really go well. But to me, it has to be about the Democratic Party having some sort of platform that addresses what these young people have been fighting for. Because all the people who were 15 or 16 when they took that knee, they're voters now. And I can tell you from speaking to them is that they see going to the polls as a tactic, just like they see protesting as a tactic. And if it doesn't look tactically sound to go to the polls, then they're not going to go. Simple as that. It's like, so there needs to be something programmatic that's put forward. First of all, the Democrats have to get a lot done between now and 2022. I mean, they have these majorities. They have to use them, no matter what a senator from West Virginia says. And for them to be able to do that is the key to unlocking what I think we can talk about is calling them Generation Kaepernick, this group of people who feel so strongly that they have the ability to intervene in US society and make positive change. It's like there needs to be a politics that speaks to that, or it will not bear fruit in that arena.
In what way did writing this book change you or your viewpoint on the world?
For me, I've never been changed by a book like doing this book. I've written, this is number 11, and this one rocked me to my core, because when I started doing it at the start of the pandemic, I was in a very pessimistic place, feeling like there wasn't a lot there to hold on to. So one of the reasons I wanted to do the book was like, well, let's turn to history then, and let's try to make sure these young people don't get forgotten. So I'll do this book. This is like, now we're into spring of 2020. But as I was doing the book, this is before the 2020 protests, I started to feel this odd sensation. And I was like, what is this feeling? Am I having a heart attack? Is my arm numb? What's going on here? But the sensation was optimism. And it felt so foreign to how I was feeling about the world. But when you speak to young people who are willing to put it on the line, it starts to make you feel like the future doesn't have to be what you think it's going to be. And, and it makes you think about, this is why history is so important. It starts to make you think about history. Like, could people in Alabama in the 1940s have foreseen the civil rights movement, for example? Could the small numbers of people who protested this odd war in Southeast Asia that nobody could find on a map in the early 60s ever have imagined what happened in the late 60s? Could Colin Kaepernick ever have imagined the first time he took that knee that thousands of young athletes would do the same? That's where, to me, the optimism comes from. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, and I don't care if it sounds treacly or Pollyanna-ish. I'm changed by talking to these folks.
I want to thank you both on behalf of Politics and Prose for this wonderful and insightful discussion. On behalf of everyone from Politics and Prose, I want to say to you all, stay well and stay well read. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me participate in this, Dave. Great book, man, and you should feel proud.
Thank you. And Michael, I am proud. I'm proud that you took part in this with me. It gives me a real lift. So thank you.
Oh man, anytime, man. I'm here to support you.
Yeah, right back at you.